the KMNN studios, this is the Kids Morning News Network.
Good morning, friends. It's September 18th, 2024, and welcome to the Kids Morning News Network podcast. I'm Alex in the KMNN studio. It's National Cheeseburger Day, so if you like cheeseburgers, today's the day for you. And if you missed the announcement last week, this podcast has changed from 3 times a week to every Wednesday. Hopefully, with just one show a week, I'll be able to bring you longer stories and more interesting ones. So stay tuned. Last week in space, the very first non-governmental astronauts went for a walk. Yeah, I know. What does that mean? Well, in other words, 2 astronauts went for a spacewalk, but they weren't part of a government space program like NASA or the ESA. They were people flying on a SpaceX craft, and they went further out in space than any humans since the last moon mission, which was 50 years ago. The 4 crew members spent 5 days in the Dragon capsule, which is about as big inside as a school bus. At one point, they all put on their spacesuits and opened the hatch into space. 2 of the travelers then poked out of the hatch into outer space, took a look around, and then went back inside. It's a big deal when regular people can go that far into space and take a spacewalk. Maybe, someday, that's what we'll do instead of going to amusement parks. But first, they need to make cotton candy and funnel cakes in space. I'm not sure if you noticed, but last September, the Earth was shaking for 9 days straight. It wasn't an earthquake, which is a rumble that happens for a short period of time and then ends. This was more of a pattern. The Earth would vibrate, then stop for 90 seconds, which is a minute and a half, then vibrate again. Scientists who study Earth vibrations, they're called seismologists, heard these vibrations through their instruments all around the world. Well, it took a while, but they finally figured out what caused them. A giant tsunami, a wave of water 600 feet high, or 200 meters for you metric types. That's the length of 2 American football fields, or 15 school buses, but you didn't hear about it. This wave was caused by a landslide in Greenland. A glacier at the bottom of a mountain melted, and the mountain that it was holding up collapsed into a fjord. A fjord is a deep, narrow inlet from the ocean, sometimes a long way from the ocean, which is what this one was. This landslide happened in a narrow fjord way back in Greenland, and the water that was pushed out of the way had nowhere it could go quickly. So it made this tsunami that sloshed 600 feet up the other side of the fjord. And then it sloshed back, and sloshed back again, and kept sloshing back and forth, hitting the other side of the fjord every 90 seconds for 9 days. Like the world's biggest bathtub. Fortunately, there was no one in the fjord at the time. Scientists are now rushing a 50-foot-high rubber ducky to the world's largest bathtub. Time for today's riddle. Last week's riddle was from the riddle battle between Bilbo and Gollum and the Hobbit. What has roots nobody sees, is taller than trees, up it goes and yet never grows? Answer, a mountain. This week's riddle is, which 2 words, when put together, contain the most letters? Which 2 words, when put together, contain the most letters? I'll give you the answer next Wednesday, but you've got to make sure to follow or subscribe to the Kids Morning News Network podcast so you don't miss it. One of the most endangered animals here in the United States has one of the worst names, Snot Otter. Yes, I said Snot Otter. Well, if you feel that's not a nice enough name, how about lasagna lizard, which is what some people call it? That's not much better, is it? Well, the real name actually sounds like some kind of dragon, the Eastern Hellbender. But it's not a dragon, it's just a salamander. Salamanders are amphibians, like frogs and toads, meaning they're cold-blooded, they have backbones, they don't have scales, and they can live on land and in water. But the Eastern Hellbender is probably bigger than any salamander you've ever seen. They can be 29 inches long. That's more than 2 feet, almost as wide as your desk at school. They used to be pretty common in the eastern U.S., especially in streams in the Appalachian Mountains. But habitat loss and water pollution have made snot otters hard to find. And by the way, they're called snot otters because their skin is slimy and they do look kind of like an otter, except maybe without the cute part, because they're green and they have wide, flat heads and bug eyes. Oh, and lasagna lizard is because their skin is floppy like a cooked noodle, which is actually a good thing for a salamander. They can absorb oxygen through their skin, so more skin folds means they can absorb oxygen better. Scientists are trying to save the lasagna lizards by breeding little lasagnas in captivity and then releasing them into the wild. Some hellbenders are being trapped in one place where there are more of them, then released somewhere else where there are fewer. One of the trickiest parts of snot otter science is just counting them. Scientists have to spend long stretches underwater in icy mountain streams wearing scuba gear at night. Hellbenders are shy. Have you ever seen an Eastern Hellbender? Let us know if they really look like lasagna by sending a message through the link in the episode description or an email to kidsmorningnews@gmail.com. This past Monday was International Day for the Preservation of the Ozone Layer. Whoa, that's a mouthful, but it is important. The ozone layer is a layer of gas, ozone gas, in the upper atmosphere that absorbs ultraviolet radiation from the sun. Ultraviolet radiation can cause health problems to living creatures like you and me, people. In the late 1970s, scientists discovered that the ozone layer was disappearing, or more accurately, it was being destroyed. Chemicals made by people were wearing away this very important part of the atmosphere. The effect was greatest over the North and South poles. Scientists started to talk about actual holes in the ozone layer over the poles. Holes over the poles. Say that 10 times fast. In the 1980s, countries came together and agreed to stop using the chemicals that were damaging the ozone layer. Well, good news, it's working. The World Meteorological Organization, which is part of the United Nations, says that most of the world should be back to ozone layers last seen in 1980 in the next 16 years or so. The polar areas will take longer until 2045 over the Arctic. That's the North Pole, and 2066 over the Antarctic, which is the South Pole. So this sounds kind of obvious, but change can make a difference. And people can come together to make the world a better place. All right, I like to end with a poem, and I don't do it often enough. Today, in honor of our favorite amphibian, the snot otter, here is a poem about another amphibian called the frog. Be kind and tender to the frog, and do not call him names, as Slimy Skin or Pollywog or likewise Ugly James, or Gape a Grin or Toad Gone Wrong or Billy Bandy Knees. The frog is justly sensitive to epithets like these. No animal will more repay a treatment kind and fair. At least, so lonely people say, who keep a frog, and by the way, they are extremely rare. Well, I don't keep a frog. I don't really have to, because special correspondents Liam and Finn are really good at finding toads in the yard. That's this week's show. Thank you very much for listening. Please follow or subscribe to the Kids Morning News Network on your podcast player, your podcast app, your smart device, or whatever you used to listen to this week's episode. I'll be back next Wednesday, and I hope you are too. From the KMNN Newsroom, this is Alex, signing off.